All right, it is 12 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. We know some people still may be joining us, but I will pass it off to Evelyn Nelson to get us started here today.
Super. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to get rolling with our Better Behavior Together Echo. I know it looks like we have some returning faces and some new faces. So really looking forward to both a lively session today and throughout the course of our series. I'm Evelyn Nelson. I'm the PI for our Telehealth ROCKS program. So Telehealth ROCKS, it encompasses some of the education trainings we have today, as well as some work that we're doing around telebehavioral health and also supporting social determinants of health in the school-based setting. I just have a few reminders as we get rolling today. Just to say out loud that the session's being recorded. And that helps us. We'll be able to share that recording with you at the end of the session. Your microphones have been muted, but we really are interested in your questions and comments. So please do unmute or use the chat to ask those questions throughout. Your completion certificates will be emailed at the end of the series. With that, I see folks have been successful adding their first and last names. That really helps us get the certificates to you. I think, let's see here. I think I've hit the high points with that. To give you an idea, we'll have introductions and then our presentation and then our group discussion. So with that, I'll hand it off to our presenters today so they can introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone, and happy Wednesday. My name is Melissa Maris, and I am a consultant living in Missouri. I'm a clinical community psychologist, and I've been working with and consulting with Telehealth ROCKS now for a couple of years. My background is in school mental health and really focusing on sort of system state level change to promote high quality school mental health efforts in all sorts of different sizes of school districts, especially the super small, super rural districts. So glad to be here today.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be with you. My name is Lenny Swales. I'm a psychologist at KU Medical Center. I spend about half of my time doing clinical care, so I'll be ducking off at 12:50 to go see my next patient. And then my other half of my time, I get to do really fun things like this, where I work with communities around early childhood development, parenting, developmental disabilities, and then also best practices related to mental health. So I'm glad to be with you guys today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alice Zhang, and I am a behavior analyst by training. And I, kind of similar to Lenny, I do some clinical work, but mostly doing research and also a lot of training associated with best practice, parenting, and support, especially supporting families in the rural communities. So before we get started to talk about the content today, first, welcome everyone, and also just want to describe a big picture of who we are in this audience. And I know not everyone is here yet, but we had 60 people who registered for this series. And out of the 60 people, we have, not surprisingly, because we have had a tradition of a lot of school friends joining us. So this time, we also have 79% of the people who are from the school system. And we also have some from the community and from social services as well. And we definitely have a very diverse group where we have school counselors, social workers, behavioral interventionists, administrative people, including principals, and also paraprofessionals and nurses, and a lot more as well. Next slide, please. So also, thank you to all of you who have helped us complete our pre-survey or the evaluation, because we do want to make sure that we are using following an evidence-based evaluation approach with all our training and continue to use that information to improve our training so that and getting your input as well. So there are a couple of questions that we are trying to help us better understand our audience and also your peers. And one of the questions is the level of expertise related to understanding challenging child behavior and creating positive behavioral support. And we're really happy to see that the majority of the people, or over half of the people, feel competent, or they feel like they are in a very advanced knowledge with that. We do have some people who felt like they may be at the beginning level, but I think this is great. That's why we are having our training. And another question that we thought would be helpful to highlight is expertise related to consider trauma when we are doing assessment and also treatment for children with challenging behaviors. And we have a lot more people who consider themselves as advanced and expert, which is awesome, because we do want to, because this learning ECHO is really a learning community that we teach each other, we help each other. So when we have those experts in the audience and in our community, please feel free to share your expertise and help each other out as well. Next slide. So a quick project disclosure statement. Again, we do not have relevant financial relationships with the manufacturers of any commercial products or provider of commercial services discussed in this activity. We also do not intend to discuss any approved or investigative use of commercial products. Anyway, the basic message is that we're going to use best practice evidence that we are aware, and we do not have any biases or potential conflict of interest. Next slide, please. So after the session, Christy, she's a rock star. She will send you all the slides and the recording and the resources that we may share among our community, and also maybe from presenters as well. And so expect to receive an email with all those good information. And if you have questions that you feel like you need to have more conversation or follow up, please always feel free to email us at telehealthrocks@qumc.edu. Next slide. So Lenny.
All right, so I wanted to give you guys a roadmap of, this is the first in a 4-part series, so we're so glad you guys want to hang out with us on your lunch hour on Wednesdays. Today, our goal is that we're going to be talking, so the overarching picture of the series is that we did surveys and got feedback from our ECHO community and asked, hey, what do you want to hear about? What would be meaningful, important to you in your schools? And we heard is behavior. Which is great because that's one of my favorite things to talk about. So it was a match made in heaven. And we thought that today we wanted to set the foundation for our future sessions. So we'll be focusing on the question today of why do kids act out? We're going to be talking specifically about the role of COVID, trauma, and then also talking about behavioral functions as underlying reasons why child behavior can be more challenging in this day and age, and then also kind of in individual kids. In future sessions, we'll be diving deeper into more specific topics like anxiety and depression, ADHD and acting out behaviors, and then finally wrapping it up with autism and social engagement. So I am really curious to hear from you guys. I'm going to launch my first poll. I want to hear from you in your experiences working with kids. Do you feel like you've observed increases in children's challenging behavior since COVID? So I'm going to give everyone a minute to answer that. Oh, we have 20 out of 20. So ending the poll, sharing the results. A resounding yes. 90% of people said that they do feel like they've seen an increase in challenging behavior since COVID. So my next question is, what do you feel like has increased the most? So you can only choose one. Do you feel like it's been acting out in class and noncompliance, aggression, difficulties with peer relationships and social problem solving, work refusal, school attendance refusal, anxiety, depression, or trauma exposure? So a lot of different options, and I'm curious to know in your setting what you feel like you're seeing more of. So we've got 16 of 32. Give it a little bit more time. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and, oh, a couple more people. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. It's been a pretty good scatter here, I think. So the the majority said acting out in class and non-compliance, followed by difficulties with peer relationships and social problem solving, but a pretty good spread here, I think, across the different options. So thank you guys for sharing that. And whatever you said, I was going to say you're right, because I anticipated that people are seeing, and we're hearing about this all the time, right? This increase in change in both child disruptive behavior, acting out behavior, emotion dysregulation generally. And what we're hearing from teachers and educators like yourself is matching with the large scale data that we're finding as well. So I was pulling the data last night because I wanted to have the most recent. And we are seeing an increase in parent depression. So parents are reporting higher levels of depression, about almost 2.5 times as much compared to before the pandemic. That's a huge amount of increase in parental depression. And then obviously we know that parent depression has a big impact on child behavior and vice versa, right? So we're also seeing similar substantial increases in child externalizing or acting out behaviors, internalizing, so anxiety and depression. And then also, if you're looking at kind of the severity of some of those difficulties related to mental health, we're seeing that there's increases by 40% of hospitalizations for suicide and self-injury in kids. So this has also led to the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, has declared kind of like a national emergency in the state of child mental health. And I hope that leads to an increase in devotion of resources, especially to school-based mental health. Some more details on the impact of COVID on child mental health. One thing that I think is really positive is the data shows that this can really be buffered by strong parent-child relationships. So when they're looking to see which groups are most affected or seeing this biggest change, the people who are doing the best are the ones who have that strong parent-child relationship. And they're also seeing that's kind of layers of stressors. So we already knew that before the pandemic, there were certain things that could increase someone's likelihood of having more mental health difficulties as a kid. So we know ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. We already knew that was associated with differences in mental health outcomes. And with COVID, that seems like it's sort of compounding. So in kids who had higher ACE scores before the pandemic are also having more negative mental health impacts. When parents are struggling with their own emotion regulation, that seems like it's also translating to kids too. So positively, for kids and families where parents are really feeling strong in their own mental health and their own emotion regulation skills, those kids are doing a little bit better. But conversely, those parents who are struggling more, their kids are also struggling more. That strong parent-child relationship that we talked about. And then the other group that seems to be kind of disproportionately impacted by the mental health effects of COVID is neurodiverse individuals. So individuals with autism or ADHD or intellectual disability, it seems like that group is also having more of these mental health impacts, which totally makes sense, right? Lots of change in routine, lots of disruption in services that were provided by schools or other places. Looking specifically at schools, 87% of schools in a national survey from last year reported that they feel COVID has led to poor social emotional health. With classroom disruption, which is the one that you guys identified as the big one, was the biggest challenge that was reported. So what you are seeing, I want to normalize it for you. What you're seeing is what a lot of other educators are seeing too. Thinking generally about mental health, we usually think about negative feelings or stressors. Someone can cope with that either by turning inward, so experiencing more anxiety and depression, or turning outward, so more acting out behaviors, disruption, aggression. But the same negative feelings or the negative stressors could be triggering both things, right? It's just kind of how you cope with it. Do you cope by acting out or do you cope by internalizing? But I also want to provide some reassurance. Even though we are seeing this increase in challenges related to mental health, the same strategies that have worked before are the same ones that are going to work now. The idea is just that if we know that so many more kids and families have been impacted, what we need to do is figure out how to use these strategies in a more global manner, the same strategies that we already know are effective. And we're going to talk about some of those over the course of the series. And then the other thing is we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Just because you're seeing big behaviors doesn't mean that we need to have some sort of big new type of intervention. The same strategies that work well for all kids are also going to work well for kids in the time of COVID. And big behaviors don't require big interventions. They just require doing the basics with more consistency and maybe for a longer period of time. So I'm going to turn it over to Alice next so we can kind of go back to those foundations and talk about those basics that we know work well for all kids.
Yeah, thank you, Lenny. And talking about what can we do, as Lenny mentioned, is really going back to the basics, what we know that has been evidence-based and has been working. One of them is really important, is about assessment. And assessment for disruptive behaviors is the foundation about creating a good intervention. And one of the things that as a behavioral analyst is really important to really make sure that when we talk about behavior, we really define it in a concrete way, so that the definitions are clear and complete. There are so many times that, when I do parent training with parents and when we ask parents to identify the behaviors, we really have to make sure that we are talking about terms or descriptions that are clear and concrete, so that we know when we're talking about tantrums, what exactly parents are talking about. Is it flopping on the floor? Is it crying? Is it a combination? And sometimes when we think we are talking about the same thing, we might talk about some behaviors that are quite differently topographically. So again, just re-emphasize the importance of when we do that, making sure we clearly define the behavior that we are looking at. Next slide, please. So I think the basics again is the function of the behavior, which a lot of you probably are very aware of it. And we're talking about the sensory, sometimes related to biological discomfort or comfort, automatic responses. And we are also talking about escape. So avoiding demands, avoiding instructions, avoiding aversive situations, and attention. And attention, sometimes it could be attention seeking for the most part, but a lot of times we forget about is from escaping. Sometimes we could escape from attention that we do not like as well. And then the last one is tangible. We want to get the thing that we want to play. We want to look at our favorite TV show like 24/7. That's possible if we have the choice. But anyway, so this acronyms are SEAT. So it's very easy to remember, SEAT. One thing about this is that this is very basic about functional behavior, but things that I always try to remind myself is that oftentimes we feel like maybe this is one function, maybe this is escape, this is seeking attention, or maybe this is sensory. But a lot of times behaviors have multiple functions, and it could be a mix of those four things. And also, we as behavioral analysts, I also want to acknowledge that a lot of times we do focus on the immediate function, but there is beyond immediate function, which I will talk about in the next slide. Next slide. So in terms of the beyond the immediate function, I want to direct your attention to this picture. Maybe you have seen it somewhere else as well, about the antecedent and the behavior and the consequence, which you might have heard it as ABC as well. Antecedent is what happens right before the behavior, and the consequence is what happens as the result of the behavior or after the behavior. And a lot of the times that people are not talking about a lot is that there's another term that is really, really important. I know this is called motivating operation. You might not have heard about it very often, but it's just really about the person's history, the environment, and how that may impact whether something is reinforcing to you or punishing to you. So it's a very, very important terminology adding to that ABC to explain how behavior works. And also in the context of trauma, a lot of times trauma can serve as a motivating operation where either they create a safe environment or because of the history of aversive experiences, which result in a reduced sense of safety in environment, and which may make a lot of the environment context become more aversive or hyper sensitive. So when we talk about taking data, we want to make sure we take data about what happens after, what happens before, the ABCs. But most importantly, we also want to understand the history of the students that we are working with and the history of reinforcement and learning they have as well. So next slide. So here are my some slides that I thought is super fun. Maybe some of you already are well aware of it. Some of you may feel like there might be something new in there. So let's see. So we're going to talk about reinforcement, punishment, and extinction. Next slide. Okay, so what is reinforcement? And to make it a little bit simpler, it's just something that occurs after a behavior that increases the future likelihood that the behavior will happen again. So again, the reinforcement is consequence, but that increased future behavior. And we know that there are positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, which sometimes can be very, very confusing. I don't know whether any of you have watched The Big Bang Theory, but there is an episode where Sheldon was trying to do something with Penny, and then they were talking about those concepts, and then the screenwriter obviously did not get the concept correct. So positive reinforcement is adding something to increase the behavior. So just like the picture here, a lot of times maybe it's a baby who is trying to learn how to walk, and the parents are being super excited and smiling and holding their hands out to welcome them. That could function as a reinforcer, a positive reinforcer. But also there is negative reinforcement, meaning that taking things away, that can also function as a reinforcer to increase the behavior. So the picture here is using the example of putting on sunglasses, right? So the sunglasses will help and reduce or prevent having your skin be tanned. And that is something that would function as a reinforcer to increase the future likelihood of you wearing sunglasses when you are outside for a long time. So here's the level up. I don't know. So if you have any interesting items or activities that function as a reinforcer in the past, then you may not even expect that to be functioning as a reinforcer. Please feel free to put that in the chat.
I'm also hearing people talk in the chat about staffing challenges and how that can make it harder to implement behavior plans. Include in the chat too ideas people have had about quick and easy ways to use reinforcers with kids, or things that haven't taken a lot of effort on the or time in your limited staffing environment. I'm curious to know from the expertise of this group.
Okay, so a little bit more about reinforcements. A lot of times we hear teachers say, the reinforcer just does not work. And, it's a little bit, frustrating sometimes that you planned things so well, you hope it worked, but it did not. But the truth is, if a reinforcer is not working, it's not changing behavior, we absolutely cannot call it a reinforcer. We can call it a potentially preferred items or activities, but it's not a reinforcer unless it changes behavior. And also a lot of times that since I work with parents a lot, and Literally one time I observed one parent was trying to ask the child to do something, and then the child was not doing it, and parent was like, you do this first and I will get you, ice cream. So I have to stop parents there for a little bit and talk about the difference between bribery and reinforcement, right? Which happens a lot. And so the difference between bribery and reinforcement is that with reinforcement, you really plan ahead. You want to make sure that you see that behavior happens and you provide that consequence. But with bribery, sometimes it happens when you are frustrated, when you feel like you are a little bit helpless or powerless, you don't know what to do, then you started throwing in those things there to hopefully change the behavior. So that's a big difference. Next slide. So another big concept is about punishment. So kind of similar to reinforcement, punishment is something that occurs after behavior that decreases the future likelihood that the behavior will happen again. I felt like with this audience, it's probably not necessary for me to like emphasize punishment does not equal a coercion or harm. But a lot of times maybe you will run into parents or other people who have those misconceptions about punishment. So punishment is really talking about the effects of decreasing the behavior, not about its form. So a lot of times when we talk about a positive punishment, we're talking about add something to decrease the behavior. So one thing that is very on the picture left here, when a little child is touching the hot pan or a stove, that is a positive punishment if the child in the future stops touching a hot stove, right? Or sometimes maybe when the parent is telling the child, no, don't do that, put that away, don't, we're not running or whatever that is. That kind of reprimands, if that decreases the behavior, that is a punishment, positive punishment. In terms of negative punishment, a lot of times it involves taking away something. So a lot of the common discipline strategies like, okay, because you did this today, you are not going to be able to watch a full 20 minutes TV tonight. That is a form of negative punishment. Next slide. The next one is, I just see Lenny, easy reinforcer, thumbs up for on-task behavior. That's a good one. Or just really attention a lot of times can be a really, really powerful one as well. So some of the general strategy with the use of reinforcement and punishment are relying on reinforcement to bring about a change in behavior whenever possible. With the field evolving, we are, at least with a behavioral plan, we try to use positive reinforcement as much as possible. And also important information about punishment is that punishment on its own does not teach any new skills. So same here is like when you teach, you should be teaching what to do instead of just telling people not to do something. And then there's a really interesting story I heard from a colleague who said the teacher was telling a student to do not run in the hallway. And the student was being a really creative one day. So instead of not running over the hallway, the student starts getting on the floor and rolling down the hallway. I'm sure you all have a lot of great stories about how students sometimes can be very creative in following your instructions, right? So another thing is that reinforcers and punishers are individualized and change across time and settings. So one basic and classic example is that sending students to the principal's office may not be serving as a punisher at all, and may be very reinforcing indeed. Okay, next slide. I see that Christina had a comment there. I had a child this morning tell me they were not running, they were speed walking. Hey, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like, what's the difference between walking and running? There's a threshold. Maybe they are just on that spectrum, reaching running.
They're trying to get you to operationally define running, it sounds like.
Right? You have to define like the actual speed, how many miles per hour or whatever that is, how many steps per minute. Okay. Good point about operational definition. And the last concept I want to talk about here is extinction. So extinction is stop reinforcing a behavior that is previously reinforced. And here is a classic example, right? Sometimes when we are trying to get some soda, some food out of a vending machine, we put things in there and we try, and most of the time it comes out, it does not come out. We try to shake it, we try to rock it, and then at the end of the day, hopefully not everyone is doing what this guy is doing with this picture, like kicking the vending machine. But you do see that behavior become more and more intense when that behavior is not reinforced anymore. So handling extinction and extinction burst can be quite hard because the behavior really increases in its intensity, frequency, and duration, and sometimes even in topographies. So some of the behaviors that you may not see in the past may join and may add to become new behaviors in those challenging behaviors. So here is a graph that you probably have seen very often, particularly in your psychology textbook, about how extinction and extinction burst works. So one thing that we all know, at the beginning, the behavior is going to go up and get worse before it's getting better. And also another thing I have to emphasize with with parents that I work with a lot is to remind them of the spontaneous recovery. Because I have parents come back to say, oh my gosh, I thought it's finally gone. I thought we already addressed that. Why did it happen again? And I just have to tell parents, like, it is called a spontaneous recovery. And it's going to happen. It's natural. We just have to do exactly what we have been doing that is effective, and that will eventually go away as well. In terms of handling the extinction burst, is one thing really important is that if you have to give in, do it early, but don't do it often. So before the behavior escalates to a full-blown, maybe trying to give in as early as possible when you are not in an environment you can handle that extinction. And then the worst thing you can do is wait and then reinforce the behavior. And once you do that, what happens is that you're going to create a new elevated baseline. So the next time the baseline is not going to be the first, I guess I can now point to the screen. It's not going to be the first 2 lines in between, whereas the initial behavior response frequency is going to increase it quite significantly. And one more thing that is really important when we talk about extinction, and a lot of times when we say we ignore the behavior, we do not ignore the person. It sounds a little bit like, how do you do that, right? Like this, how do you ignore the behavior, not ignore the person? I think one thing that's really important to do is that you still care about the safety, you still care about the emotion of the child. But if your plan is to ignore the yelling and the screaming, you are just not responding to those type of behaviors. But you still care about other behaviors, and you care about their safety, and you reinforce any appropriate behaviors. Next slide.
I always tell parents ignoring is a very active process. You don't get to go take a nap and get a cup of coffee. You're sitting there waiting for the split second you get an appropriate behavior, and then you are all over that again with your positive attention. So the other thing is, sometimes I think people think that the idea of behavior interventions and trauma-informed care are at odds, but they're really not. So that's what I'm going to try to tie together in the next couple of slides. So first, I want to have a little bit of understanding of some of the brain changes that we can see in individuals who've experienced early and chronic trauma or stress. We know that there have been studies that have found differences in the amygdala, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for mood control, emotions, and that fight or flight response. So thinking about kind of the emotion regulation difficulties we've all observed, that can actually stem somewhat from some of the brain changes that we see with early trauma. Second, we see changes in the hippocampus, which is the part of your brain that's responsible for memory. So if we're thinking about kids who have had trauma exposure, they might take more time and repetition to learn new expectations than other kids. Similarly, we know that trauma can be intergenerational, right? Where oftentimes the kids we're working with who've experienced trauma, they come from parents who've experienced trauma. And so if we're trying to connect with their parent and teach them new strategies for managing behavior, they may also struggle with emotion regulation, retaining and applying those things, right? Because of those changes in the amygdala and the hippocampus. And then the last thing that we see as far as brain differences is differences in the prefrontal cortex. That's the front part of your brain that's also really implicated in ADHD. And it's responsible for impulse control, organization, and executive functioning. So if we're thinking about some of those early changes in the brain, we can see more emotional dysregulation, hard time remembering and learning new things, and a more difficulty with impulse control. So even if the coping strategy they've learned, they might have a harder time remembering to use that in that impulsive moment. The other change we see biologically is a difference in the what's called the HPA axis, which is this system throughout your body where you release cortisol in response to immediate stressors. So this is the part of your cortisol is what's helping you learn how to respond to stress in the moment. And we know that early and chronic stress can lead to longer term dysregulation with the HPA axis, meaning that someone has a harder time dealing with stress moving forward. When we're thinking about not all trauma is necessarily created equal. So there's some types of trauma that can be more, can lead to a more difficult impact long term on brain development. We know these things are worsened by earlier neglect, chronic neglect, earlier placement in foster care, and having multiple placements. So the other thing is, let's think together about trauma and learning. So in addition to differences in brain responses, children with a history of trauma exposure may have learned different ways to cope that might have been adaptive in other situations. So for example, in a situation where that might have been neglectful, taking what you need from another person without asking, or even when they're protesting, that's getting your needs met. And that might be something that worked really well in that neglectful situation. And then also going back to Alice's point, it reinforced it, right? They got what they needed. Similarly, kids learn by watching. It's called social learning theory. So even watching someone else do a behavior like yelling or fighting, and then seeing that that person either got what they needed or didn't have negative consequences, that also teaches the child, hey, that behavior gets reinforced. So fighting and yelling seems like an appropriate way, or a way I've seen other people manage these situations, and so I'm going to model and copy that. The other tricky thing is the reason why a behavior started, which could have been because of trauma exposure, some of those neurologic differences that stem from trauma, or that observed and learned behavior, that can be different from what maintains a behavior or makes it keep happening. So for example, a child might have witnessed that verbal and physical aggression, they've learned it, that behavior was then, reinforced. Now they're at school where that's not necessarily what is being modeled for them, right? And now they engage in that verbal or physical aggression, and perhaps they get attention for it, or perhaps the demands are removed. So they might have now the behavior started because of that trauma exposure, and it might be being maintained because of things that we're doing in the environment. And that's where your behavior intervention plan, that's where your FBA can be really helpful at figuring out, hey, we know that trauma might have been the reason this originally started, but in this current setting, what is it that's leading to this behavior continuing to work? How can we adjust our intervention to really identify the current function of that behavior in this setting? So we can't control past trauma, right? That's outside. It would be cool if we could, but we can't. So the question is, what can we do now based on what we know? So we can offer resources to kids to process trauma. We can also, we know that from the research that positive relationships, like the ones with your teachers or family members, those can buffer those early traumatic experiences. So that's something that is within your control, and that's pretty cool. We can also show, we can show consistency. So even let's say a behavior was sometimes reinforced, sometimes not at home, whether it's taking stuff you needed or arguing or yelling, we can be consistent in our approach at school. And with that support and patience, the hope is that even though kids with trauma might have a harder time with memory, our hope is that if we're really consistent in our approach, we can help them learn new ways of managing that. The challenge is it's going to take a lot of patience on our part because it might take longer to learn that. The child's response might be slower. It might need more repetition, guidance, and support. So linking back to our idea before about COVID and how that's impacting kids and families presently. One of the other things that we know from the research and the data is that there was a significant decrease in the number of child abuse reports that were happening. And even in hospital referrals because of physical abuse. And then, unfortunately, if you look at that data more, the cases that were being seen in hospitals were more severe. So what that likely tells us is that kids might have been experiencing more trauma at home, especially during some of the stay-at-home orders. And because they didn't have that same connection with school or outside therapies or medicine, they weren't kind of the more subtle parts of trauma weren't getting reported as often. And thus we are seeing more cases of more severe trauma. Does that make sense, that connection that I'm trying to make there? Okay. Um, so again, we know that kids with trauma also need behavior-based interventions, but they're going to need it for more consistency and for longer periods of time. So just like we talked about before, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to show more patience with implementing it. So this is not at all going to be the last time we talk about trauma in this series. It's going to be a common theme, but I wanted to give us kind of a common foundation. So the silver linings is that humans are amazing and resilient. One of my favorite research terms is this thing called benefit finding or post-traumatic growth. And what that means is that people have this incredible capacity after stress or trauma that they can see still the silver linings. They can see things that they've learned from it, they've gotten out of it, have led to, an improvement in their understanding of the world. And it's really amazing. You can see this in cancer survivors and trauma survivors, all sorts of groups. And what's interesting too is the ability to find those silver linings is also associated with better mental health long term after experiencing a traumatic event. So if you look at the literature, people are already starting to find some of these benefits with COVID. Some people are saying, hey, I found more time to be with my parents, for kids, they said that, or with their family. They found they had kind of a slower pace of life in some ways. But I'm curious from you guys, and this is where I'm going to turn the screen share over to Christy. I'm curious for you guys, what are some of the changes, what are some of the silver linings that you've experienced in your life or in your work with COVID? And we're going to do a word cloud for that. So everyone can go ahead and click on that link in the chat box and enter in what your silver lining is. Okay, so ooh, I'm seeing family is really big. Time. Um, if this is working the way I think it's working, usually if more than one person puts in something, the word gets bigger. So I love how big family is. It sounds like that's been a consistent silver lining. More time together at home, um, life pace, prioritization, um, increased flexibility, self-awareness, empathy. Oh, these are all wonderful things. Connection, increase in gratitude. Somebody figured out the way to make your phrase all be one word is put dashes in there. Nicely done. All right. Well, I'm going to turn it over to ask any final questions that folks might have.
Lenny, we had a question in the chat from Kylie who asked if we had any recommendations for the trauma that escalated behavior creates for the other students.
Oh, wow. I really appreciate that question. I love how thoughtful you're being about the mental health of all the students in your classroom. Um, I think that in some ways it's a great opportunity to teach compassion and empathy to other kids too, to think about, um, being able to talk with other kids about how we all have big feelings sometimes and being able to reflect on what that's like for each student and say, what helps you when you're having big feelings to calm down. But I'm also curious for Melissa and Alice or also others in the chat if you have suggestions of things you feel like have worked well for your students.
I um I totally agree with what you said, Lenny. I think general education information about behavioral health and emotional health, all those things, I think can start at a very young age, as long as we can explain it in a way that makes sense to the kiddos based on their age. And also one thing, when we were in a preschool classroom, we're actually actively teaching children the skills when other children are engaging in some of the challenging behaviors. And we try to explain to them that they might just need some moment themselves and what you need to do. For example, try not to look at them when someone is flopping on the floor, or not try to go up there and wait for the adults to take care. And it's okay if you want to ask the child whether you are okay, but do not try to, I guess that's just like a way to try to make sure that the children, the peers, are understanding what's going on, but at the same time, are not accidentally reinforcing some of the behaviors through peer attention. So yeah, that's kind of how I feel. Melissa, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you all highlighted a lot of the ways, the things that I would say, and also a lot of really great comments coming through here in the chat. I always try, especially when thinking about classroom level interventions. So when we're talking about a context where there's probably several youth, is one kind of Lenny's prompt early on of like, what are the simple reinforcers and what is easy, what is simple, and what can be helpful for as many young people as possible. So, long ago, it used to be that, an individualized education plan that like it was very much about that one individual student. And so then you'd have, and I remember a time of like rubber bands on wrists and counting behaviors and trying to do these things. And so these teachers were in these classrooms trying, several of you all who are on this call, trying to implement multiple different behavior plans at the same time with a whole entire classroom of young friends, which is just impossible, right? And so the more you can do that's going to help everyone, the more it's going to help everyone, including maybe this friend. So keeping it simple, but then also having that same response. And so that there are shared expectations in our classroom, that we are kind to each other, that this is a safe space, and acknowledging what's happening in the classroom. I think a lot of times we as adults become so uncomfortable in realizing that we are, because of this one young friend's difficult feelings, that now all of these other people are having to experience their hard time. And so we kind of shut off our brains to what's really happening by pretending like the kids don't notice. And they do. Of course they do. They probably notice it way more than we do in some ways. And so just acknowledging the elephant in the room, I think sometimes, I mean, especially if you've had a situation where a friend has had to be removed from a class, just saying it, saying, wow, this is really hard. Wow, that was scary. I'm going to take a few deep breaths and make sure that my body is calm before we move on, kind of modeling through that behavior too. And yes, Shelby, I love this connection before correction, right? Maslow before Bloom. Thanks for all of these other terrific comments here. So were there any other questions here? Allison's saying that they have met with the class separately to process the situation. Absolutely. Some of you all might be doing something that's kind of in the neighborhood of a restorative justice kind of approach. So especially if a friend, as they are exiting a situation because they can't be safe with their bodies, they do something like tear things up or break something or say something, this idea that, you know, they have now kind of introduced something and they've harmed the safety in that space in some way, and that they need to, that there are ways that they can work to repair that as they re-enter that space. And again, this is where, you know, putting on super practical hat of, you know, what would we want? So if we had really big feelings and we acted out and did something we know that we shouldn't do, and then we leave, what would we want when we come back into a space, right? Like we would hope that we could say we're sorry, that we could acknowledge what happened, that we can make amends if possible, right? And that like we wouldn't just pretend that nothing had happened. So all great points here. So in our last few minutes here, we wanted to talk through the case presentation or scenario. So traditionally for these echoes, the format is that we would have the didactic component, kind of what you just saw, and then we would have an opportunity at the end to delve into a case. And so typically what this means is that one of you all would share a case, and kind of in this format. So this could be a case that is current, or it could be something that has happened in the past, but just a case presentation or scenario, and that you would provide a brief description of that. That there would be some questions from the panel or potentially other folks who are in the chat, that there would be some recommendations and a summary. So this can be really simple and straightforward. But what we have found is that when we have this opportunity to talk about how this content applies specifically to a case, that it can be really, really valuable. So we would love if you all would be willing to share a specific case. And it can be something that has been really tough, or something that you feel like you kind of half got right, but you still want more help with. And we'd love for you all to take a second and just submit a case. This does not have to be elaborate. Of course, don't share any identifying information, but it really just becomes a way for us to make sure that we're taking this content and applying it in a very real world scenario. The best part from my perspective is that afterwards, when you get all these different, you know, ideas and recommendations in the chat, so now you essentially have a problem solving team of 35, 40 people who are giving you ideas of things they've tried, things that might work, but also we summarize it afterwards and send it back to you. So then you have kind of that written summary. And again, we are always available to problem solve, reach out to us with that email address. But if you all want to take a couple minutes and just click on that link that's in the chat and just submit a scenario. So just provide some really basic demographics and provide as much of this detail as you can or want to, but really we're just trying to get a little bit of a snapshot so we can understand the problem, and then we talk it through, ask some questions, and then make recommendations. And what we really try to do is identify cases that align with kind of the different content that we're presenting in terms of the different didactics. It's helpful to identify kind of a main behavior of concern. So the thing that would be really the most helpful for us to talk about and problem solve around, if you have tried anything, so any interventions that have been kind of somewhat successful or not successful at all, that we can talk through. And also if you have any questions. So again, thinking of this as a time and a space where, you know, we are here, but as are all of these new friends who may also and absolutely do have great ideas and might be able to share some suggestions there. And so we have an example of a case, and I think it's probably on the next slide.
Wait a second. So I also just want to add that we have this a red cap survey there. You can put the information in, but also if you would rather to have someone call you and just get the information down for you, you can also just let us know your contact information and we will call you and make sure that happens.
So this is a sample scenario, and just kind of to give you a flavor of what this can look like. So some basic demographics, a little bit of background, so it doesn't have to be super comprehensive, but kind of focusing what the chief kind of primary behavior of concern is, to kind of help us steer ourselves in the right direction. It's helpful to identify or to provide any background that would help us rule out anything. So if it's, you know, if you're talking about a young friend where it sounds a whole lot like this one thing and you know it's not that, to just say like it's not that. So there's no history of trauma exposure, right? So like just kind of laying that out and you know, kind of focusing in. It's always helpful to identify strengths, and we'll always come back to that anyways of, okay, so this friend sounds really challenging. What are some things that we like about them? What are their interests? If there are any diagnoses that are helpful to share, again, interventions tried, and if you have any questions for the ECHO community. And it can really be you know, about any piece of it. So how you handled it, feedback on how you handled it, feedback on what happened with the parent or guardian, feedback on why you couldn't continue it, whatever it is that would be helpful at that point to kind of talk through. So we just wanted to give an example of this. This should not be a heavy lift. It's meant to be something pretty straightforward, but it just gives us a chance again to talk through concrete challenges that are coming from you all so that we can try to be kind of immediately helpful around kind of a really specific issue. If we can go to the next slide. So key takeaways, Alice, is this going back to you or do you want me to continue?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, so key takeaways, reinforce behaviors that you want to see more. Teach replacement behaviors if you want to decrease challenging behaviors. So that idea that if we're going to take away a behavior that's seeking something, we want to replace it with a different behavior that is seeking that same thing, so that need is getting met. And trauma can lead to big behaviors, but don't reinvent the wheel. Go back to the behavior basics. And I know Lenny said it before, but as someone who does a whole lot of trauma-informed kinds of training, I just want to reiterate and underline what she said. A lot of people seem to have this idea that trauma-informed and behaviorism are somehow complete opposites, and that they are different, and that you can't have one and the other, right? That somehow they oppose each other, and that's just not true. At its root, trauma-informed looks a whole lot like positive behavior supports, which looks a whole lot like every classroom management strategy ever, right? A consistent, predictable context. Trauma-informed just helps us have a larger toolkit, but they're definitely not antithetical in terms of how they hang together. And then finally, Lenny already mentioned this, but definitely send us an email if you have questions. Again, if you are curious about this case, you don't really want to fill out the survey, you just want to talk to us, or if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. We love questions. We love chatting and trying to better understand how we can best support you in the good work that you all are doing. And again, after we get off the meeting here today, here in just about 10 seconds, Chrissy will follow up and send the slides and some additional resources. So keep your eye out for that. Did I miss anything, Christy?
That is it. So thank you for joining us today. We will send the slides and recording as soon as we can. We do have to process them, so it will be a little bit later today or early tomorrow. We look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, November 2nd for our second session. we will talk about anxiety and depression in that session. So we will see you all then.